Hello, James. How are you doing?
I'm great, Glenn. Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv, also patreon.com/Glenn Show. When I'm not talking to John McWhorter, that's every other week, I'm talking to somebody else. And this week it's James Lindsay. James, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more extensively?
I suppose, yeah, I run a website right now called New Discourses. I try to put out material explaining broadly what we might call the woke movement. That kind of grew out of the research that I did to help write a book called Cynical Theories that came out this summer that explains the postmodern component. I know it's a philosophical word, but the postmodern component of the woke way of thinking. And that grew out of what I'm probably formerly at least was best known for, which was the Grievance Studies Affair, which was a series of academic hoaxes isn't quite the right word. Fake papers is a better way to describe it, for a technical but correct reason that we did in 2017 and 18, myself along with Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, who wrote Cynical Theories with me. So I've been writing. I'm an author. I have a PhD in math, not in any of the social science or humanities type stuff. But I've been writing, I guess, professionally ish. It's hard to make money writing for about 10 years now. So this is sort of what I do. And right now I've dedicated all my time to explaining the philosophical and activist and kind of historical precedents that have led us to the, I would say, woke catastrophe that we face at the moment.
Okay, and I gather that Cynical Theories, which I tell you I have not had the opportunity yet to read, but it's on my list. And I gather did very well, bestseller lists and all of that. I gather that Cynical Theory sets out some of your overview of postmodernism and its deleterious influences on intellectual life in America and more broadly in the rest. So, what
Right.
you and Helen Pluckrose, what are you guys after in the book? And I also want to hear more about the hoax stuff.
Right. So Cynical Theories, if I had a copy, I do actually, hang on. I have a copy, and I'm not doing this to shill, but if you look at the cover, it says critical theories and then criticals crossed out and it says cynical on the
Ah,
cover.
okay.
So what it's actually trying to detail is what happened in history, I guess, intellectual history, is that there's a movement called critical theory. Many people have now heard of it. It's considered fairly obscure. It began in the 1920s. It's kind of rolled ever since. And what happened is in the 1980s and 1990s, a batch of critical activists started looking into the French postmodern philosophy and Kimberly Crenshaw, bell hooks in particular, and they started to cherry pick from the postmodernists, so Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, etc. And I should also have mentioned Judith Butler there, and probably Gayatri Spivak and Edward
Derek Bell.
Said. Derek Bell was not cherry picking from the postmodernists. He actually is very materialist in his approach. So his work would have been more in the vein of critical theory and less in the vein of postmodernism. Kimberly Crenshaw was his student, his PhD student, and or maybe it's, I don't know if it's a law
Law school,
doctorate
no
or,
doubt.
yeah, yeah, it's law school. She was the one who started to incorporate elements of postmodernism, mostly probably following the lead of bell hooks, who was talking about it in most of her writing through the 80s, and following the lead of Judith Butler, who had just picked up a garbled copy of Derrida and created her own new post-structuralism or whole new deconstruction that's not the same as what Derrida recommended in the first place. So these people in the 70s or in the 80s, I should say, picked up postmodern tools to apply it to critical theory. So the book tries to, what we did was we worked backwards from the theorists of today, Robin DiAngelo, for example, in critical whiteness studies, as they call it. We can name, I don't know, probably 100 different scholars who are all working in this kind of woke scholarship. The most touch point name is Robin DiAngelo with her book White Fragility. And we worked backwards to see who were they citing and who are they citing and who are they citing. And what we found is that nearly all the roads lead back to Michel Foucault. And so it's been a big argument in the academy since the 90s. Has postmodernism died? Is it done? what's going on? And we make the argument that no, it mutated. And in fact, that the critical theorists picked up postmodern epistemology, their approach to knowledge being an application of power, and started to apply it to the the radical activism they were already doing. And so we try to tell the story of how postmodernism got appropriated to intellectual and activist life from 1990 to today.
Okay, now forgive my ignorance. I'm just a humble economist over here.
Good for you.
What is postmodernism? Again, I know that's going to sound like a very silly question, but I have
No,
to
it's a
ask.
hard question, because all the people who were postmodernists denied that they were postmodernists. And then you have people like Judith Butler, who are extremely postmodern, who said that if we defined postmodernism, it wouldn't really be postmodern anymore. So I can't be a postmodernist and there can't be a definition of postmodernism. But my kind of working definition, given what's going on, is I mean, we could pick a number of working definitions, but one of them is the belief that a claim upon truth is actually an application of power. That in fact, to make a claim on truth, you have to have been given the power to make that claim, the authority, whether it's by becoming a humble economist, whether it's by becoming a scientist and being credentialed with a PhD, whether it's by being appointed to a presidential council or the cabinet or whatever else, in order to make, like Fauci has been appointed to the role that he's in, to speak on behalf of COVID-19. So their claim is that power decides who gets to claim what it is and is not true. And so, as Michel Foucault had it, his belief, and I think this is really quintessential of Foucauldian postmodernism, is that if you have a claim upon the truth, a statement that you're saying may be true, it might actually be true or false, but that misses the point. That Foucault said it misses the point to discuss whether a claim on the truth is actually true or false, because the point is that you have to interrogate the power dynamics that allowed somebody to have the authority to make that claim. And so it's a complete shift away from epistemology into turning everything into kind of this squabbling about power dynamics. There are other definitions that we could apply. I mean, the postmodern condition, for example, just to broaden this impossible thing, as laid out by Jean-Francois Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition, is 1979 when he wrote that. He said that, simplifying in the extreme, very famous sentence, I define postmodern as an incredulity toward meta-narratives. Meta-narratives being broad, sweeping explanations for how things work and how things are to be contextualized. In a sense, what postmodernism could then be boiled down to is that every attempt to talk about how the world works is sort of on an even playing field, where none of them should be believed too seriously. They should all be seen as kind of social and political constructions. In other words, the social or cultural construction of knowledge and its relationship to power is the primary object of interest of postmodern philosophy.
Now, every claim seems inordinately strong, but
It does.
some important claims resting on power dynamics seems like a hypothesis worth entertaining.
I agree. In fact, I point out that if we look, I mentioned Fauci quite intentionally. If we look at how the COVID-19 policy, there's much skepticism, at least on the right, around it. If you look at this situation, the way, Fauci said, don't wear a mask. Then he said, wear a mask. Then he said, wear 2 masks. Then he said, the CDC maybe doesn't know if you should wear 2 masks. Then he said, nope, probably 2 masks. And maybe we have to do 3 masks. When you see this kind of thing happening, people say, how did this happen? Why is the number changing? Of course, science has to find answers and develop. I think it's reasonable to say, people are making their best guesses, and as they get better information, they'll update those guesses. But there's also the possibility, when you get into anything fuzzier than like Newtonian physics, which is quite cut and dry, you get into anything fuzzier than the very hard sciences, that you do have this kind of human element that has to be investigated and interrogated. I would say that that's probably something that you face a lot in economics as well. It's a difficult, what am I looking for? The order of complexity of the problem is extremely high. And so human influences are a little higher than, say, building a rocket to go to Jupiter, which is just straight, simple Newtonian mechanics, and you can get it there with a second's worth of accuracy. And they are a little bit nuanced around this. But if you read, for example, Lyotard, he's quite, I just mentioned, he's absolutely just savagely critical of science as being one of these kind of meta-narrative type things that needs to be doubted, that it's just another form of legitimation by parology, he calls it, which means legitimation by consensus rather than legitimation by finding, reliable evidence. And then later in his life, he says that he actually didn't know what he was talking about with the science, and he actually just butchered that by making a bunch of assumptions, and that he claimed near the end of his life that that was like his most embarrassing work. It's his worst book, and it's taken as kind of the staple. So these guys were intellectual show-offs, and they were primarily working within, they were looking primarily at soft sciences, where I grant them 100%. It's not well developed. It's not hard and fast. And there's a lot of the stuff they were talking about present there.
These guys being the French theorists.
Postmodernists. Yeah, I just think they were cynical in their approach, to be honest. Good observations, bad prescriptions, very cynical.
Well, there is some stuff. I was just having this conversation this morning with somebody about money. Uh, he was saying money is not real. He's saying money is a fiction. And I was trying to explain, no, no, no. What money is a convention. It's a convention that works because of the mutuality of people's expectations.
Mm-hmm.
I take the dollar bill from you, which is worthless in and of itself, only because I anticipate someone else will take it from me in return for something that's of value. They are willing to render something of value to me for that dollar bill in turn, only because they anticipate that others will buy into the convention that the dollar bill can be exchanged for things of value.
Right.
Now, that is a very interesting intersubjectivity of human convention. It's not real in some objective sense. It's subjective, but it's extremely powerful. And we can, the dollar bill is the least of these. I mean, what about debt? What about the complex financial instruments that we see being exchanged? What about Bitcoin? All of these things are constructions of a kind, and there's it just seems to me to be a lot of traction in being able to enter into that kind of reflection.
So what I would tell you is that you have encountered, where you have an extremely nuanced view, you've encountered kind of the postmodern flattening of that view to, no, it's a convention, all these complicated, important things to understand. Yes, it is in some sense a socially constructed artifice, and yet to say it's just a fiction. That's the postmodern flattening of something much more complex and nuanced. And I think that you find this repeatedly, especially, Lyotard's confession about science later, is that there's a lack of desire to fully understand the thing they criticized. And there's often while many of their descriptions about power, especially social power, are very spot on and very worth entertaining and worth mining, I would say, for what they can teach us, especially about a world where social media is dominant. At the same time, cynical, simplistic, underinformed, and disinterested in any level of complexity or deep understanding, any perspicacity, is how I would characterize their work. Foucault wrote these genealogies. He originally called them archaeologies, and the most contemporary copy of what he did is the 1619 Project. They unearth various truths, contextualize them in a story that paints a consistently more negative picture than reality, whereas there are other ways to interpret that same data or to flesh it out with other data and create a more, I think, fair picture of what's actually going on. So it's very easy to be pessimistic and cynical that way. And I feel like that's a trap they fell into.
Well, I've been very critical of the 1619 Project here at the Glenn Show and elsewhere, so I wanted to note that. However, I wanted to then go on and ask you, how could the dispute between different narratives, Nicole Hannah Jones and the 1619 Project, we should think of the founding of the country as 1619, slavery is elemental. The principles of the founding fathers were not actually realized because of the structure of American society at that time, slavery, not least amongst the offenses. And we've been struggling for 200 plus years to right the ship here or to realize the ideals that were and we should understand that through the lens of African American freedom struggle and so forth. That's one story.
Yep.
Another story is, America, the exceptional nation, land of the free, and so on. What is the objective ground for discriminating as between these narratives, other than the power of people, the control, the podium, and the mediums of information dissemination, the news media, the prizes that are given? Isn't it ultimately a struggle for power? I mean, is there any
Almost.
objective way of ascertaining whether there's a correct or incorrect narrative about the American founding?
So what I would tell you is the 1619 Project is an attempt to rewrite the mythology of America. And I would tell you that the mythology of America that we promoted in the 1950s was certainly a mythology of America in a very real sense. It was definitely mythological. This exceptional nation. There are reasons that we could say that America is special. A nation founded on ideas, for example, is one particular way. A nation that's based in hopefully neutral principles of constitutional law, as adjudicated as best as possible by an imperfect judicial system. But nevertheless, we have an attempt to rewrite a mythology competing against, and in my opinion, just to render it flatly, is that when we look at these critical race theorists, because that's who these people are, Nicole Hannah-Jones has picked up a large amount of this, whether she is one or not, technically, she's picked up a lot of this line of thought. What you have is an attempt to write a new mythology to replace a mythology that was dominant in the 1950s. And they act as though that mythology is still, from the 1950s, is still the thing to compete against, as though that is still the predominant belief of most Americans, which I think is an absurd claim. I think that we actually made a lot of progress since the 1950s, but for their stuff to make sense, they have to pretend we have not, and that all that progress has been fake. So you mentioned Derek Bell, and that was essentially his thesis. The Civil Rights Act actually just made things worse. Brown versus Board of Education just made things worse for African Americans. And that's his thesis. It's a very pessimistic and almost paranoid approach to what was happening, although it's not to, again, replace it with some rosy garbage like, no, we passed Civil Rights Act in 1964, Voting Rights Act in 65, another Civil Rights Act in 68, and then everything was perfect. Nobody believes that, I don't think. Right? But there's this comparison between these two national mythologies that very few people, if you were to get down to brass tacks and do a poll, especially 4 or 5 years ago before all this stuff blew up, very few people would believe either one of those mythologies in whole. And so this is where we look at that, incredulity toward meta-narratives. These mythologies are meta-narratives about the United States. So we have to be a little bit incredulous about these. Now, is there an objective podium from which we can find? I don't think so, to be
That's my
honest, not
question.
fully. But there are matters of fact. We can read Thomas Jefferson in his own words that he wrote himself, struggling with the issue. We can read Abraham Lincoln in his own words, struggling with the issue. We can read Frederick Douglass in his own words, attacking the issue and appealing to that set of ideas that the United States was founded on. And so, this is, I think, when people say we should tell the history of the United States, warts and all, I agree with that. I think that we should not mythologize ourselves to some, glorious, perfect thing that never was and still isn't. But at the same time, we don't have to adopt this very useful to activists narrative, this other mythology that paints the picture much more darkly than it is. So in a sense, painting the picture too bright is an error, but painting the picture too dark is also an error. And seeking to do responsible, ethical, historical work, for example, to understand the people who were involved at each stage and to make the best out of what they were saying, I think is a way to, as we say, straighten the record or correct the record as much as possible. And we should strive, I think, with the fog of history, the epistemic fog of history is real, but we should strive to have the most clear and accurate understanding, and we should try to unearth more documents and more context and understand and accept what's real and what isn't real. rather than trying to force a story onto something and then make that story seem real by contorting the data. And again, I could tell you how Foucault did this with madness and homosexuality. And what I see in the 1619 Project is a willful attempt to deny progress. It's a story that says this was bad, then this happened and it was still bad, then this happened and it was still bad, then this happened and it was even worse. Whereas that's not really a great way to tell the story. That's not reflective at all of reality.
Okay, I'm going to try to defend Derek Bell here. It's going to require a little bit of effort, but I knew Derek Bell. I actually reviewed Faces at the Bottom of the Well when it was first published, and I was a critic. I was a Reagan conservative back in the 80s and early 90s. Okay. I was a critic, but I came to have a good deal more sympathy for why he didn't see the successes of Brown and the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act and the general agenda of civil rights progressivism as an adequate resolution of the problem with the subordination of slaves and their descendants. I came to have a greater appreciation for that. So I'm going to try to offer a defense to see how you react to it. I'm sitting in 1980.
You may find me pretty receptive to this.
Okay, so I'm sitting in 1980. There are 500,000 people under lock and key on a given day. Maybe 40% of them are Black. In the year 2000, I think Derek Bell died before 2000. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, let me tell my story. Over the course of the next 2 decades, the incarceration rate in the United States rises to where there are 2 million people under lock and key on a given day, and nearly half of them are Black. A lot of that has to do with the war on drugs. It doesn't have only to do with the war on drugs, but a lot of it has to do with the war on drugs. Now, if the people subject to all of this imprisonment, this 3 strikes and you're out, this longer sentences, this draconian imposition of state power had been white, the deliberative processes of American social reflection would have been vastly mobilized on behalf of the project of reform. But because they were Black, goes this story, it was not. They were expendable. They were people in our collective political imagination who were less than fully human. We didn't see their humanity. It was possible not to see it because they were Black, and it was possible to impose this draconian regime. But let's examine this regime for a minute. This regime is a political outcome. This is not etched in stone. This is not nature. There's nothing in the natural order of things here. These are judgments that institutions have made and are enforcing. And by the way, they're incredibly violent. The scale of the mobilization of power and the infliction of power of state coercion on these populations is incredible. It's an amazing, it's not slavery, but if I am reminded of slavery by what is going on, please forgive me, because the imposition of state powers. And moreover, what's the root of it? The root of it, at least in the drug area, is huge numbers of Americans are hedonistic, consumer-oriented, wealthy, spoiled. Many of them, maybe even most of them, white people who want to get high. That creates $100 billion a year commerce in illicit traffic. At the same time, we want not to embrace our hedonism fully, and in a hypocritical fashion, we let it, okay, I could go on in this vein. You see where I'm going with this. We are balancing our cultural budget on the backs of the weakest people. This is latter-day racism. Yep. To not see it as latter-day racism is to buy into a fairy tale about the nature of this country. The real nature of American democracy is being exposed by this. And if I don't demystify this structure, in other words, this is not just law. They break the law. They're being locked up for breaking the law. If I don't see where law comes from, if I don't understand why law doesn't change in response to negative consequences of its application, if I don't see this as being rooted in racial history, I am living in a fantasy world. The real world is a world of racial domination. It's going under a different cover in the year 1990 than it would have been in the year 1890. But it's pretty much a very intrinsically American story. And by the way, critical theory, Foucault, Derrida, and company helped me understand and express this criticism that I'm making right now much more effectively than before it came along. What's wrong with that?
Not much, to be honest, in the big picture sense. But this is where let me tell the same story from Foucault's perspective, and maybe you'll get what I'm laying down here. So Foucault looks at the history of sexuality. This is probably his most famous work. History of Sexuality. It's in 4 volumes. It's voluminous. The first volume is the most relevant.
You've read
so he
this,
says way
you've
back
read
in
these
the day,
volumes. Excuse me for interrupting. You're a mathematician, as I understand it. You've read these.
Unfortunately, I have read.
Okay, just check.
I've read Foucault. Foucault's not that bad. I will confess to have only kind of read Derrida, because nobody can read Derrida. It's impossible. And that's, I think, literally true, because he did wordplay in French that doesn't translate, and the translations are all bad. Derrida went to the day he died complaining nobody understood a damn thing he was saying. And if you try to read Derrida, you'll understand why. It's impossible. So I have read Foucault. I've tried to read Derrida. That's all anybody can say.
I'm impressed.
I've read all these guys. Yeah. Well, Foucault's not terrible to read, actually. He's a bit grandiose. But at any rate, his argument boils down.
I've read Discipline and Punishment.
That's
the only one. Excuse me again. I just want the world to know that
I mean, we could do Discipline and Punish too. I'm just not as familiar with I can rattle off the history of sexuality a little bit more tightly.
Please proceed. I apologize for interrupting you.
No. It's good, because incredulity toward having read postmodernists is a common thing, because they're very difficult to read, and they're not pleasant to read. But anyway, history of sexuality. He starts off saying way back in the Christian domination days, homosexuality was regarded, this is again a social construction, it was regarded as a mortal sin. It's just an absolutely heinous thing. It's an abomination against God, yada, yada. And so you had to put gay people to death. You had to throw them in holes. They would talk about Discipline and Punish here with a grate over the top of them, in the dungeon, etc. You have to just absolutely persecute gays on religious grounds. And then along comes, in the 19th century, sexology. People start studying homosexuality, and they come to the conclusion pretty rapidly that it's a mental disorder. And so now we're no longer considering homosexuals raging sinners, although the Christians may still. The more refined and intellectual people, the intelligentsia, are seeing them now as psychologically disordered. So what do you have to do with them? Well, you have to put them in asylums. You have to electroshock them. You have to you have to lobotomize them. You have to do all these horrible things in the clinic. We talked about the history of the clinic. So what he says is, we had bad times, and then we went to more bad times. And then later we see, again, it's still criminalized. It switches to where, okay, maybe it's not a mental disorder, but it's criminal. This is leading up to the 1950s. And then leading into the 1970s and 80s, it's still, it's no longer criminal. That battle has been won. And now it's just absolutely a social taboo. And, the gays are forced to meet in secret bathhouses where he ends up contracting AIDS. He believed to the day he died that AIDS was a social construct primarily to control the gay population, even as he was dying of it. And what his argument is that this there's no improvement from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4. There's no improvement whatsoever from that. This problem with homosexuality is on the metaphysical plane. It's a sin, an abomination against God, to maybe it's something inside somebody's head. I see that as an improvement, even though the conditions didn't improve much materially. And then from there to, maybe it's not actually a psychological disorder, but it's still bad. And now you've removed the disorder aspect from this. And then you go a step further, and now it's just socially taboo. He doesn't see this as a progress. He sees it as where at no point in that progress is anything perfect. He sees it as just the same manifestation of the same problem all along. But for me, if you have moved from saying that there is a literally otherworldly reason that you can't possibly touch, that's utterly unfalsifiable, for why gay people are intrinsically bad, to maybe it's inside their head, maybe it's something in the world, you've made tremendous progress. And he doesn't acknowledge that progress. And I think that Derek Bell's doing something similar. Now, I have a very probably controversial opinion. I think that Derek Bell, and I think, in fact, Robin DiAngelo, are at the most recent end of the same spectrum, are pointing to very real things that they misdiagnose, plus this relentless pessimism. I don't think that Derek Bell's wrong for pointing at what he's pointing at. I think he's wrong for pointing at the causes, or he's misdiagnosing the causes. I think he's correct as you steelman and put his argument forth. But the causes of these things, it's very simple to say. First of all, it's similar to in ways, but not identical to slavery, and that distinction must be acknowledged. And I think that this pessimism tends to miss that, right? Certainly, it's different than slavery. Slavery, where people were literally being bought and sold and not considered to be humans, or not considered to be, it's a very different thing from, well, you're a human who broke the law and you have to go to jail, and yeah, there's going to be hard labor and we'll probably profit off of you. This is a very different thing. It's not good. I didn't say it's good, but it's different, right? And so if you completely negate that difference, you're doing something a little bit pessimistic and a little bit cynical. Further, my thinking on Derek Bell is that what he was actually looking at, and you may disagree or agree with me, I don't know, is that what we saw in 1964 was we saw not only the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but we saw President Johnson begin the Great Society. The Great Society was, in many programs, probably quite good, but in other programs, it established entitlements that had horrific effects on poor communities that skew disproportionately Black and brown. And those entitlement programs, and I mean entitlement programs, began to skew things in a particular way that created those conditions. Now, why is it relevant to bring that up? Because this was a failure of progressive policy. I say this as somebody who's identified as a progressive for my entire life. This was a failure of progressive policy that had bad unintended consequences. But then to say, oh, this is just a revamping of racism. What it was a sloppy hand trying to fix a problem in a ham-fisted way that created new problems that have very similar expressions. Now, by 1990, 1992, when he wrote Faces at the Bottom of the Well, what's really going on here? Were Black people throughout American society, was racism gone? Glenn, I tell you, I live in the South. No, it wasn't. 1992, it was still pretty racist, okay?
I believe you.
I live in the South. I have seen the change. I have lived through the change, okay? I've seen it. And I assume that from 1990 or so back to 1970, I assume there were also changes, but I wasn't there for those. I was born in 79. I don't really remember before the late 80s very well, so we'll leave it at that. But I've seen the change since 1990 to now, these past 30 years. There's been a lot of change, a lot of change. And so what's going on in the 1990s? Certainly there's still racism. Certainly, I mean, we had Joe Biden standing up, dropping this particular crime bill that we're actually kind of pointing at. We see the impacts of the attempt to put in affirmative action and where that worked and where it didn't. We see people deciding maybe we need to back off from that. And then we have certain activists, Derek Bell among them, are thinking, no, pedal to the metal. We need more of this. And so you have a whole lot of stuff going on. But at the same time, you also have, and I'm not doing the let's play the exception card, but you have to recognize he's writing Faces at the Bottom of the Well in 1992. It says that Black people are at the very bottom of the well. Oprah Winfrey has the biggest television show on TV. Michael Jordan is the most famous person in the world. Michael Jackson's just king of pop, king of everything. He's Bill not totally Cosby. Weird yet. Bill Cosby, you have to watch The Third Rail, but yeah, the #1 television show. Right. Things were not the same. And I'm not saying like, look at the exceptions and forget. I'm saying things were not 1970 anymore. Things were not 1970. I remember in the 1990s, I loved to watch Black comedians. I still think Black comedians did more to end racism than anybody because they helped people, white people in particular, learn to laugh at themselves. The critical theorists, the critical race theorists say white people need to learn that they have a culture. Like Richard Pryor told us that. Are you kidding? We were laughing about that 30 years ago, guys. Like, you don't have to shame us for something we were already, we already dealt with, except maybe the progressives who haven't realized this. So what I'm seeing with Derek Bell and what I'm seeing with Robin DiAngelo is progressive people. And Derek Bell's different, of course, because he's Black versus Robin DiAngelo is white, but Robin DiAngelo, I think her whole book is a confession to this, is that the progressives have had a pretty bad track record with confronting their own racism, and they're projecting it onto everybody unfairly. And I think, therefore, many of the things they say are true, but they don't apply to everybody. They don't apply to society at large. They apply to the bubble and the circle that they ran in.
What exactly is
That's how
the
I read
progressive?
Robin DiAngelo, for example.
What is the racism of the progressives? Can you spell that out?
Well, there's this wonderful book. If you haven't read it, it's a true gem called "Good White People" that was written in I think 2014 or 15. It's Shannon Sullivan. She's not small, but Robin DiAngelo is great for this too.
Okay.
And or we could go back to Malcolm X. You could, all of these guys, and even Martin Luther King in his most frustrated moments in Birmingham jail, all talking about the white liberal this, the white liberal that. So the Good White People is about white progressives and white liberals, which Robin DiAngelo defines as someone who thinks they get it, somebody who thinks they're less racist, somebody who thinks that they're not racist. And DiAngelo says, and I quote, "Good white liberals do the most daily damage to people of color." Okay. So what these people are the people who are writing policy like the Great Society or like Joe Biden's new equity program. They think they're helping. They aren't bothering to actually connect with people, whether it's black people, whether it's Trump voters, whether it's whoever. They're up in their, whether it's ivory tower or I guess it's maybe pearly white tower or whatever it is. And they're refusing to actually meet people where they are. They're refusing to actually try to find what's really going on. But they are, we say virtue signaling, but they're signaling, I have the right views on this issue. I know what's best. I know how to do it. And they think because they are on the right side, this is how we would define this. They think because they're on the so-called right side of history, that they are, I think DiAngelo is right, not racist, and they don't have to argue with themselves. They don't have to dig into themselves and see what's really going on here. I said years ago, I said, I read these critical race theorists, the white ones, the critical whiteness studies, I should say. I read these people, and what I think is they're the kind of person who walks down the street and a black person walks by the other way, right? And they see that black person, and they say in their head, not out loud, I mean, that would be really weird. They say in their head, there's a black person. And then they think, oh my God, I noticed. Oh my God, I noticed. And they continue. I can't believe I saw race. I can't believe I saw race. The next thing you know, they just hurry back to their apartment and type out an angry blog post about how seeing race is racist to project that out into the world. And that all white people do this. And it's, I think, almost a form of mental illness at that point, to be honest with you. And I don't think that it's coming from a place of honesty or reckoning. I talk to my conservative friends, which I have many of now, and they say, yeah, we've been being called racists for 50 years. So we've all had to like ask ourselves, are we? What do we do when we encounter racial difference? Are we? And most of them have reckoned through this and have gotten over it. And they watched, again, the black comedians who so purposefully made good fun. And I mean that in the haha good sense, good fun of white culture and made it visible. Did all the stuff that these shame merchants are trying to do now, but they did it in a way that worked, and they did it in a way that brought people together, able to laugh, share a room, etc., rather than having to do whatever there is now where we have to go into separate struggle sessions. So maybe that wasn't a very clear answer, but I find a lot to agree with misdiagnosis with these people.
I was going to confess to something. So I mentioned John McWhorter at the beginning. He's my conversation partner here at the Glenn Show, a regular.
Yeah,
we're black. We're the black guys at blogheads.tv. That's what we call ourselves, the black guys, and we're being a little, ironical in doing it because we actually want to advance a view of the world that is not conventionally ethnocentric and sort of focused on our blackness so much. We think that's a part of our persona, but it's only a part of who we are. On the other hand, we are the only black guys at blogheads.tv. A lot of people who listen to us and comment say, thank God for you. You're helping me understand what's going on. I'm so glad to see your voices and so forth coming out. And I keep thinking when I read these comments that, well, we're black. And the fact that we're black, we're giving them cover. We're saying something that they might think too, but feel it would be racist to think it. But now seeing a black person say it, like there's just too much crime and violence in black communities. There's just too much incivility, and the behavioral problems that are manifest when we see the homicide statistics are a deep manifestation of pathology in the community, which is not simply structural racism. To say that it's structural racism is to put your head in the sand. They hear us saying things like that. Those are things that they've been thinking themselves, but have felt unauthorized to think. Now we've given them the authority to think it, this kind of thing. Uh,
No,
and
I
I
mean
sometimes
that's
have
the
misgivings about that. I mean, about playing that kind of a role, and having my race be used in that way. And I worry, but the net calculation I've made is that John, I think, agrees that we have to tell it the way we see it and let the chips fall where they may, and not get into this business of calculating who's listening, what will they think. What about the alt-right? The alt-right are citing us. The alt-right are liking us. I mean, that's a very deep problem if the alt-right are like, oh, by the way, are you on the alt-right, James?
not that I'm aware of. I mean, I keep finding out from other people things that I apparently am. And so, I mean, no, I'm not on the alt-right. In fact, I still probably, if we looked into it, I probably skew left with most of my policy and certainly most of my social prescriptions, but I would not skew woke in anything.
So
So if
what do you think?
alt-right means not woke, I'm super alt-right.
Okay, well, no, it means presumably it means a lot more than not woke. It is necessary, but not sufficient to be not woke in order to be alt-right.
Yeah.
Uh, but
No, I'm not a big fan of racial calculations at all, right? I'm not a big fan of it. And I actually end up getting myself in trouble a lot because I forget that you're supposed to make these calculations because I just don't. I'm in trouble with I'm being accused of being anti-Semitic now because I didn't make that calculation correctly, apparently, as a Gentile. I'm not Jewish either. I keep getting asked if I'm Jewish now, but
what did
I'm
you
willing to
say?
touch those third rails.
What did you
Oh,
say
I
or do
said
that got?
that there.
Yeah.
I said something true, which is always the most dangerous thing in the world to do. I said that as I've actually encountered it. So here's something that happens. I have to give a little context. If you criticize the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, what a lot of people don't know, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory is where a lot of the woke movement has its roots. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory was virtually all Jewish people. They were almost all Jewish. In fact, they may have all been Jewish. As far as I know, all the prominent ones were Jewish. They also escaped the Nazis by the, skin of their teeth, got brought over to the United States, first Geneva and
Yeah.
then the United States. So they have, a pretty anti-fascist, anti-Nazi kind of streak in them, as one should appreciate. But they also were Marxists, or neo-Marxists technically. And they therefore, and you can read it explicitly in their work, wanted to tear down Western civilization for a Marxist revolution, not for a Jewish anything. This is very important to point out, apparently, because people don't understand. And so when you have actually a group of well-financed Jewish people who ended up having a lot of influence, Columbia University, UC Berkeley, UCSD,
You want to name
CIA,
some of these people?
Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer. Sure. I mean, Jürgen Habermas, not so much. He wasn't as relevant. Marcuse, probably most relevant, to be honest. Herbert Marcuse, probably the most relevant. So when you
He
have
was a
these kind
protege of
very,
Angela Davis, wasn't he?
he, in fact, Angela Davis claims that he radicalized her, and
Yeah,
he instructed her doctorate. Yeah, at UCSD. And so when you have, and you'll notice Angela Davis probably not Jewish.
I don't
Probably
think so.
not Jewish. But when you point out that there was an organization of people who happened to be Jewish who were having a mission to tear down Western civilization.
Oh,
a lot of people who are reactionary. Yeah, you know what I said. I have been hearing from. I criticize the Frankfurt School a lot. So what I get is an inordinate number of people sending me messages, talking to me in person, saying, "James, just take the last step. Just admit it. It's the Jews." And I won't take that step because it's not correct. And I said, hey, world, this is happening. These people are gaining in strength and they're recruiting members by pointing this out. And Blue Check Twitter decided that that meant that I blame Jews for anti-Semitism and they're having a field day. And it's too important to not talk about. So let them have a field day. Like you said, you got to say what you got to say and let the chips fall. And I hear you. And the thing you're talking about, by the way, I think is one of the ugly, nasty consequences of pushing identity politics. I don't think that we were over identity, but we were closer to over identity than we are now, maybe 10 years ago. We were closer then. And the reason is that all this identity politics, the more you make identity salient, the more social significance you put into identity, the more people have to make those kinds of calculations. So social significance gets put back into blackness explicitly by these activists in the critical race theory. I can show you the quotes from Bell Hooks. I can show you the quotes from Kimberly Crenshaw, Mapping the Margins, 1991. You can look her up. There, she says explicitly, I am black is a more important statement than I am a person who happens to be black, because the latter of those puts universal humanity first, and that wouldn't be productive of identity politics. She says that. So when you put that social significance in, as a Kenyan friend of mine told me recently, you make the same mistake of 1650 all over again. And then what happens is everybody has to start playing in that social economy. So now you and John have to make this calculation. I've met John. I'm talking to you, both incredibly intelligent, thoughtful people who should be able to say whatever the hell you want without having to make calculations about, you know, how does my identity, how does my standpoint influence this? But at the same time, because identity politics have become more relevant, and because social significance is back in racial and sexual and gender categories, now we have to play this little game all the time. Where's my standpoint? What does it do? Am I giving cover to people? And of course, you will have read Shelby Steele. The moral authority argument you made is true. Moral authority has been drained out of certain groups of people, whether it's men, whether it's whites, whether it's, you know, I guess Asians now too, as a racial group, are white adjacent. So, you know, they're basically the same. Moral authority has been stripped out. And so there's this weird thing where you almost feel often, and you shouldn't, as though you have to hear a person with a particular identity or skin color or something say a thing before you can be allowed to say it. Because goodness knows you're going to get labeled, whether it's anti-Semitic, whether it's racist, whether it's transphobic, or whatever it is, otherwise, or even so. And I know that the things that you'll get called are going to be even worse, like
It's
really
okay.
nasty.
Yeah, it's nasty.
I
I've gotten
hear ya.
used to it. It's all good. I don't
That's what
want
I
to
tell
spend a
people.
lot of
You
my
get used
time
to it.
worrying about it, you know.
That's why you're so respectable. I mean, that's the thing. People who just speak the truth and call it as they see it, right or wrong, are people worth respecting.
Okay, I'll take that as a compliment. Thanks. But I want to talk about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
What do you think happened in the election? Do you think it was on the up and up? Are all these claims about fraud and misbehavior and whatnot obviously wrong, and people should be driven out of public life if they entertain them?
Certainly nobody should be driven out of public life for entertaining ideas. I think that that is a dangerous place to go. So we'll start there. But what do I think happened in the election?
Yeah, that's
Well,
what I'm
first
asking
of all, I have to say I don't know. And I'm annoyed with people who believe they know, because I think there's a lot of ambiguity around it. I think there are suggestive pieces of circumstantial, at least, evidence that may not indicate any bad activity or any, I don't know the word I'm looking for, irregularity. No, there were irregularities. Okay, so there were unambiguously irregularities, and those irregularities match with irregularities that we see when in other countries that indicate blatant misfeasance. So misfeasance was the word I was looking for. I don't know if that they indicate misfeasance here or not. It's the same pattern that you see where misfeasance has occurred in other places, where the votes count stopping, for example, for several hours, and then you come back online and the numbers have changed dramatically. I don't know if this is on the up and up, as has been explained. I don't know if it's not on the up and up, as you would see if it happened in Turkey. Everybody would be like, wait a minute, right? Erdogan, what are you up to? Everybody would be suspicious of this, but maybe it's on the up and up in this case. Maybe it was just mail-in ballots. Maybe it was just this. Maybe it was just that. As for whether or not there was manipulation around the election, not only do I think that that's absolutely the case, which is different than changing vote totals, by the way, outright election fraud. Manipulation's different. Not only do I think there was, Time Magazine just published their confession 2 days ago. So
what is it? What is manipulation? Define that. What is manipulation?
So in this case, the manipulations included a concerted campaign by social media to suppress certain ideas and certain views. For example, the Hunter Biden laptop story, which seems to grow and lose relevance depending on whatever else is going on in the world at any given time, but was certainly just completely suppressed in advance of the election. You saw these manipulations on Twitter, for example, that you could no longer naturally retweet. You had to push the retweet button twice. They didn't explain that to people, so people thought they couldn't just retweet certain information. Turns out that on progressive blogs or explanations of what was going on, maybe this was coordinated and maybe it wasn't. We now see the thing in the Time Magazine saying that there was literally, they call it a cabal. they call themselves a cabal of people who had organized to make sure that the information space, that the legal requirements around whether you can do mail-in ballots, where you can do them, what the dates would be, etc., all of those things. There was a cabal. It was started. That's their word for themselves. So I'm not applying it to them. In late 2019, to try to organize that the election would be, they said, safeguard democracy away from Donald Trump's manipulations. And then they just talk about all the manipulations that they did. There were certainly examples that they talk about, even in the article, where they had to keep Republicans away from the vote count tables because they were harassing. The Republican vote watchers were allegedly harassing Democrats and not wearing masks and so on. So there were definitely irregularities. There was definitely a manipulation of the media space. Whether that constitutes election fraud or malfeasance, I don't know. Whether it constitutes some form of manipulation to where you have massive social media companies that control much of the flow of relevant information, working in concert with traditional media to skew perceptions in a particular way so that, people would vote in particular ways, is another thing. Then when you look again at changing the election laws on short notice, often as we saw in Pennsylvania, in illegal ways. So there are lots of things here to where there's a feeling of manipulation around this election.
Let me stop you for a minute. I want to go on with this, but first of all, I have to say, a lot of people are going to say it's irresponsible of me to even allow someone on my podcast to say the things that you just said, because the saying of them is somehow seditious or profoundly disruptive of rationality or whatever.
And you'll notice that I started with "I don't know."
Exactly.
As my
That's where I wanted to go. That's where I wanted to go. Why does it annoy? Where I wanted to go was, what? You can't even ask a question? You can't even ask what happened? It's seditious to ask what happened? Really? Do you think you know what happened? So how would we know what happened? Are we going to be in such a state that we compel ourselves to incant a mantra about what happened because it's politically acceptable to do so without examining what might have happened? So I think you have to be able to ask the question. On the other hand, the courts, the political process, where's the evidence? I can remember that press conference that Giuliani and company had with the hair dye running down the side of his face. They alleged a nationwide coordinated Democrat conspiracy to steal the election.
Right.
Where's the evidence for that? And if the evidence for that is not sufficient to lead a court to think that perhaps something that warrants intervention has happened, don't we have to, whatever the doubts might be, put it behind us and accept the outcome of the process? So if the malfeasance or whatever doesn't rise to the level of credibly suggesting that the outcome of the election would have been different, it doesn't the sort of logic of the legitimacy and stability of our democratic processes require both the former President Trump when he was in office, but then the rest of us too, to get behind it, get behind the reading of the election as having produced the legitimate outcome of Joseph Biden being the winner?
Well, I think have to obviously agree with the caveat that we have to be able to ask the question. We have to follow the evidence, but we also have to be able to ask the question to look for evidence that may not have come to light so far. Not to say that we should have, some ridiculous number or quantity of resources dumped into it, like we might do if somebody believed for 4 years that Russia stole an election previously. Maybe, but we should be able to ask the question. So I think that the answer is that if the evidence isn't there, and I said this recently in a very colorful way on a different podcast because I didn't know I was being recorded yet. I knew the recording light was on, but I didn't think we'd started because the other guy wasn't there. And so I won't repeat the F word on your show. But I said that if the evidence isn't there, you need to shut the F up. And so we have to go with what the totality and the balance of evidence says.
Okay.
But we should also be able to remain suspicious. We should also be able to request investigations. We should also be able to ask the question. And it is the right of every human being, especially in a free country, to hold doubt of anything they wish to hold doubt about. A party line is not a strong basis for any free country. In fact, it's antithetical to one. And so, yes, I agree with you. We should follow the guidance of the best evidence that we have while being able to ask the question and being open to the possibility that the mantra is just a mantra.
A lot of people think that what happened in Dallas in November of 1963, the killing of Kennedy, was not accurately rendered the assessment by the Warren Commission. A lot of people think that. Serious people, serious historians have written books in which they raise questions of this sort.
Right.
Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No, he didn't. And then there are various accounts of who might have been involved in that. I don't recall anybody being run out of town on a rail because they doubted whether or not the Warren Commission got it entirely right, or because they were prepared to entertain one or another speculation for which there might be some circumstantial evidence. That's an entire industry, and it's gone on for a half century. So this election is not going to go into American historical memory with one narrative about it. There are going to be conflicting narratives. And there's something, I must say this, and I've already come out and said Trump should have stepped aside after he exhausted his remedies in the courts. And the fact that he didn't is to his discredit. I've said all of that. But the idea that you're going to discredit or defrock or render unemployable a person who entertains in their mind the possibility that something went on that wasn't appropriate here, that really feels quite tyrannical to me. It feels like thought control to me, and I worry about it.
I worry about it on the direct level as you do, and I worry about it on a deeper level in what it will provoke. And I'm not calling for anything. I hope nothing happens. But the truth is that when people feel like they've been stripped of any reasonable means, what they're left with is unreasonable means. If you take away everybody's legal means to ask questions, the questions are going to come somehow. What you're going to have is you have a very large population in the United States right now, many tens of millions probably, who are extremely suspicious of this election. And what I've said from the very beginning, I said this, I think from like the 6th or the 7th of November, I've said Trump and his team are not acting like people who have evidence, and the Democrats and their team are not acting like people who are innocent.
What do you mean by
They're,
that?
if you're innocent, you're open to an audit. If you're innocent, you're
I see.
open to having the question. The question being asked will vindicate you, rather than declaring absolutely unaskable, getting banned from social media for asking the question, getting shut down, being called out by a congresswoman as needing to be put on a list to be made unemployable or unpersoned.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not the kind of thing that somebody who's innocent does. Now, I do understand that we live in a fractured information space, a fractured, I don't even know. I wrote an essay a long time ago saying that the Overton window hasn't moved, it's been broken. There are two of them, and there are more than two of them, I think, now. It's been shattered. And so within each one of these little Overton windows of acceptable opinion, they don't even necessarily overlap that much. I can understand the idea that you would say, okay, we're going to, some of these are QAnon, is abjectly crazy, and we're going to just completely discredit that one, and we're not going to entertain it. But it's another thing entirely when you start not just suppressing, which is a hard question about dialogue in social media and in our social media era, but actively punishing, canceling people, making them unpersoned and unemployable as a willful act, attempting to create lists of people who participated in this. Many people who just showed up to the Capitol on the 6th to engage in what they thought was free assembly and free speech. Utterly peaceful, utterly calm, never had anything to do with what happened that was inappropriate at the Capitol, except having to have been within a few hundred yards of it when it happened, being put on no-fly lists and being harassed by border agents and things like this. This is absolutely an overreach that should be an outrage to everybody who cares about civil liberties.
It's easy,
and
to
I think
see.
we should be able to agree on that.
I do agree with it, and it's easy to see the overreach if you just switch the script a little bit and imagine facial recognition software used to identify people who attended rallies for Black Lives at which violence broke out or something inappropriate took place. And then you try to affect their employment prospects or otherwise damage them publicly because they were present at such a thing. It would be it wouldn't take long before the massive machine of progressive propaganda was mobilized on behalf of the free speech and right of assembly rights of people to express their political opinions, and you can't persecute them for having done so.
And quite rightly, there's an infinite gulf of difference between showing up to protest freely in, say, for whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Stop the Steal or whatever the thing was called, and being the person who lobbed the Molotov cocktail. The gulf between those things is incommensurable.
But what kind of person would come to the defense of the insurrectionists now? And I mean that only slightly tongue in cheek when I say it. I mean, of all the things that we could be talking about right now, why would we be defending the insurrectionists? You say you're worried about...
Why did the ACLU and the Supreme Court defend the Klan and their right to free speech?
Okay. Good answer.
I mean, I don't know anybody. I mean, I'm going to get accused of being a Klan supporter, which I'm not. But, why?
No, that would be a willful distortion. You just made an analogy. You're saying
exactly.
the reason to speak for the insurrection, quote unquote, the insurrectionists is that many, maybe even most of them, were not quote unquote insurrectionists at all, and that people should be able to assemble and express their views about American politics without being demonized for having done so.
Yeah,
just
I think
like
that the
the
people
ACLU
who were
would say that
involved
on behalf of the Klan. It doesn't mean you endorse their views, but you did vote for Trump. You told me you do endorse their views.
But let me make a point real quick, which is that I think that every single person who was involved in something genuinely insurrectionist, the people with zip ties running around in the Capitol, unambiguous that this is a problem, they should be investigated and they should be held to account by the law. And when they've been held to account by the law, they've been held to account by the law, just like every other person in our entire political system. Whatever law applies is what law applies. If that ends up disenfranchising them, because that often happens for felons, that's what happens. every single person who is actually involved should be, and I know this is idealistic, it's not realistic, but every person involved should be held in a perfect world exactly to the level of account that they deserve, given the under the law. When I say deserve, I don't mean that in some like metaphysical moral sense.
Yeah.
So everybody carrying around those zip ties should probably be in some trouble. People who just happened to be there or thought, oh, wow, a bunch of people are going in, I'm going to wander in too. Like that old lady with the flag and her mask pulled down, everybody's seen the picture of.
Yeah.
Like, what did she do? Like the guy carrying the podium. Well, you can't steal a podium, dude. But the guy just walking around smoking weed in the middle of the rotunda, like what did you do, really? As a friend of mine said, you know, we call it insurrection. People say it's a coup. A friend of mine said recently, and I just love it, calling it an insurrection or a coup. Now, there were certainly people who had that intent, but they were relatively small in number. Calling it that, given that they had no plan, obviously, once they got in, there were people just taking selfies and making videos for the gram and every other thing. He said it's 7 orders of magnitude too stupid to have been a coup attempt. 7 orders of magnitude too stupid is what actually happened at the Capitol. Now, that's an order, a matter of debate. But my hard and fast opinion is that every single person involved in the Capitol, as well as, to be honest, the various racial justice as they were, protests and mostly peaceful protests and riots, and 93% peaceful, we were told, they should all be held to account under the full expression of the law based on what they actually did. And I understand that's idealistic. I understand it's impossible to do in practice, but the best job possible should be done. So I'm not saying anybody should be let off the hook. And I'm not even saying, oh, well, a bunch of people, Antifa got away with it because the DAs dropped it, so they should drop. No, I don't even care about that. The repressive tolerance is happening, but everybody who gets arrested and gets investigated properly should be held to account for the actual crime they committed, if any. And I don't think that wandering into the Capitol after people started going in constitutes any significant crime. So those people should probably be left mostly alone.
You're worried about backlash, are you? That the Democrats are going to overplay their hand here?
I think they already are. Yeah. I don't know what the backlash will look like. They're freaking people out. I'll tell you that. They're freaking people out. I don't know how many executive orders we're up to now from Mr. Biden, close to 50, but they're freaking people out. That's for sure. There's a lot of people upset. You know, he canceled the pipeline, 11,000 jobs, I think is the number I heard, just gone. Those people mostly supported him, not happy. You know, there's a lot of people really worried about some of these orders that he's put in, whether it's about this climate stuff, whether it's about the equity stuff, canceling the critical race theory executive order. People are worried about where this is going. What's the one about the gender ideology one, where, you know, now federal funding in schools, you have to let, I guess, trans women play on girls' teams. People are worried about this stuff.
Well, I will note, this is not what the election was about. These issues were not in the main. I mean, he may have said, I'm going to cancel Keystone XL. I think he did say so. And that would be the environmentalist posture. And we know that he would have been a, you know, friendly to environmentalist presidency. Also, with respect to immigration and the border, it was pretty clear. But a lot of these things were not litigated during the actual electoral process. It was about COVID and it was about Trump.
Yeah.
But now that the outcome is in, a relatively close election, all things considered, the outcome is in, massive ideological shifts are being implemented, or at least attempted. And the extent to which they have Democratic endorsement is unclear, but there'll be a midterm election in 2022, the Congress and so forth. We'll see whether it holds. Clearly, however, the activists on the left have got a shot at doing something, and they've got an open road ahead of them with Joe Biden in the White House.
Now, let's not dodge the question though. So you have to hold me. You asked me if I voted for Trump, and I have not yet addressed. So you got to hold me to the fire. You got to hold me to the fire here, Glenn.
How so?
I did vote for Trump.
Why'd you vote for Trump?
Okay, so I went into this pretty heavily in detail before the election. There are a number of reasons, one of which is actually kind of profoundly left-wing in orientation of all things. The first thing that I noticed, and we already talked a little bit with the Hunter Biden laptop, is that you may have noticed that the media held Trump to account for an awful lot. Even things he didn't do. Yeah, right.
Stuff he didn't do.
Yeah, they kind of mentioned everything that he did being wrong a lot. And so the function, and I don't think we had a healthy media under this circuit. In fact, I think they were crazy. But the function of the media should be, in a democracy, at least in significant part, it should, of course, be to report the facts, but it should also be to hold power to account. And I see, after especially the Hunter Biden laptop scenario, I saw absolutely no reason to believe that was going to happen. That we're going to see softball media around Biden, and just what Trump was getting was just being held to account isn't even the right word.
Okay, the media hated Trump. That's a reason to vote for him?
No. Well, yes, partly, but not just the media hated Trump. The media is also defending Biden. You remember when all these people were like, oh, Fox News is just state media for Trump, just state media, and everybody understands that state media is bad? The New York Times, CNN, what are they doing with Biden? What are they doing? The state media question is a serious one. When you have a highly partisan media environment and you have the most authoritative sources in the country taking a very biased stance, you have to be very wary of empowering the side that they're biased toward. Okay. It's a little more nuanced than the media didn't like Trump, therefore. It's a little, but that's also a thing. That's my left-wing reason, by the way, is anybody who's being treated that unfairly is probably the underdog. And I am at heart still a leftist in that regard. Like, I have to take the side of the underdog. And I spent 3.5 years thinking that Trump was awful. He's probably a dictator. I bought into the whole line. And then all of a sudden I started noticing, like, wow, a lot of these stories turned out not to be very true. Somebody told me one day, just go get on your Google and type in Trump was right and see what comes up. And it's shocking. And then I started watching, I have to give credit, the walk away movement, the walk away from Democrats, Brandon Straka. He's been struck from everything now. I watched some of their videos. The very famous video in particular stands out in my memory where Trump allegedly mocked the disabled reporter. This, of course, was a huge thing.
He didn't do that? He didn't do that?
Well, okay,
because they show him.
He did that.
Okay.
He did that. But he also did that for about 30 other people before that. He would be like, Nancy Pelosi came out and I said this to her and she was like, And it's the same maneuver. In other words,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, nobody knows that. And then, the very fine people thing. Like, that one. That one's egregious.
Biden says, it's when I decided to run for president, when I saw him supporting white supremacists. And not a single reporter said to Biden, well, he didn't support white supremacists, which is actually the case. Now, maybe in someone's imagination, he's friendly to white supremacists because he hasn't denounced them vigorously enough. But in those remarks that he made after Charlottesville, it's simply false to say.
It's simply false.
And no one, not a single person said to Joseph Biden, whose reason for running for president he self-declared to have been that Trump did something that he didn't actually do. That's terrifying.
It's terrifying. And so this is part of it. Part of it, more of it, most of it, in fact, though, is that I actually know how our federal government works these days a little bit, which is to say that I understand the relevance of the administrative state, and more importantly, how it's very unaccountable to the voter, right? And so I realized that Biden is already signaling. He had his whole racial equity program. He had his whole, all of these different very progressive things he was talking about, the Gender Act he was talking about, all well before. This is all within my wheelhouse of woke studies. And I'm watching this and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, wow, this guy is going to be not always, but frequently a pen for these activists. And I have a feeling he's going to appoint to administrative positions high up in the Department of Education. Turns out that the top is where he stuck that one. I didn't think it would actually be at the top. High up in the Department of Labor, high up in the Department of you name it. You're going to see these activists getting positions.
Who has been, I'm sorry, I'm behind the curve here. Who has been designated for Secretary of Education? And what's wrong with that person? I hate to do this because I cannot remember the person's name, but I picture his face very clearly. He has qualifications in one and only one thing particularly, which is ethnic studies. Okay.
He is an ethnic studies czar. The same ethnic studies that's just we're seeing in California. That's just an absolute train wreck. We see it in Washington State, where they're literally teaching ethnomathematics instead of mathematics. Literally. And I saw that this was likely to be the case, that these people would be, I mean, I could put to Google and find out what his name is, but
Okay, so your antipathy to and your understanding of and dislike of the woke sensibility all the way back to postmodernism and such, and the fear that Biden would be the stalking horse for this kind of mentality getting into the federal government.
So this is the background, because there was a tipping point.
I'm listening.
There were two tipping points back to back. Number one, I watched those debates, which is always an error, but I watched them anyway, participated in my civic duty. I watched the presidential debates and I watched the vice presidential debate, and I watched them refuse to answer the question. Both Biden and Harris refused to answer the question, will you pack the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
There's all these articles about that, and they literally just, Biden actually just stared down the barrel of the camera like very intensely and just started talking about, it's very important that you vote. Blah, blah. He didn't even answer the question.
Yeah.
And just ran down the clock. Harris said, oh, you want to talk about that? That's very important. Let's talk about Honest Abe. Honest Abe of the Republican Party. He packed the court. Yeah, 1860. Like, that's a long time ago. Circumstances were a little different in 18. I don't know if you know what was going on in 1860 in the country. It was a tumultuous time in American history. Yeah, there's a few pages of history have been written about the 1860s. So it's like they won't answer this question, and then there's articles about how and these aren't small, like, Move On or some goofy progressive thing. They're like in The Nation. They're in like big places. They're writing things like New Statesman. They're writing things like, we need to if Trump wins, we need to if Biden wins, I screw this up every time. If Biden wins, we need to and we have a conservative court, we just need to disregard the Supreme Court from now on. If they rule against him, just ignore them. And then maybe we need to pack the court. Maybe we definitely need to pack the court. Maybe what we need to do is abolish. This was an actual article that was my final tipping point. So I'm building up with all this, like pack the court was really huge. And then all of a sudden an article comes out, and I know it's stupid, and I think it was in the New Statesman or something like this, or The Nation, one or the other. And the article comes out and it says, we need to abolish the Constitution. And it's like, this is what, and I know it's just one writer.
People are going to call you hysterical, man. Nobody wants to abolish the Constitution. That's hyperbole.
Somebody does. They wrote the article. Somebody does. And this is the thing. You say nobody wants to abolish the Constitution, but you should go open the book, Critical Race Theory, an Introduction by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanczyk. Basic critical race theory textbook. Page 3, aka first paragraph of the book says, unlike tradition, this is a close to a quote, unlike traditional approaches to civil rights, which favor incrementalism and step-by-step progress, we call into question the very premises of the liberal order, including Enlightenment rationalism, legal reasoning, equality theory, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. Critical race theorists are not reeled down with the Constitution.
Yeah, they don't like the electoral college.
So people do maybe want to abolish, and
they
then
don't
you
like
look
the
at the
electoral
social media.
college. Yeah.
The social media stuff is how do you use Twitter.com and Jack Dorsey to sidestep the First Amendment. And that's concerning stuff for me, because these guys are all on the same side, right? And they're the side that Biden's on. And so I think
the wrong side of the culture war for you, and is a good reason to vote against Joseph Biden, although I haven't really heard a reason for voting for Donald Trump.
Oh, I see Donald Trump. First of all, being that I've always been slightly left, I've never been particularly keen on some of his policy, but I was pretty happy about most of his stuff. He started No New Wars, for example. We have more peace had until like the other day, more peace in the Middle East than we've seen in a long time. Miraculously, maybe he wrangled whatever was going on in North Korea to a different level. He put China's feet to the fire where nobody else will. And that's a thing, because China is on a world conquest goal or mission right now, and nobody will stand up to them. Nobody will. Do
you remember the substantive debate that took place during the campaign about the U.S.-China relationship? Because I don't.
I don't know. No, it barely comes up. Nobody will talk about it.
What's the
But the critical
difference
race theory
between Joe
executive
Biden?
order, by the way,
Yeah,
it
go
was
ahead.
key for me too. Culture war again, but nobody will dare touch this thing. And
This is
finally, you
where
have a president come out and say it.
Trump declares that the U.S. government won't be using critical race theory ideas in the employment process of federal employees.
Right. And in federal training. And it's very important because people do not understand this. Chris Wallace, or who is that his name, in the debate, asked him, he said, why did you get rid of diversity training? He didn't. Section 10 of the order. Section 10 of the order straight up says this is not to be construed to cancel diversity training. It is these specific teachings, these specific policies, these specific ideas in section 2 of the order that are prohibited. It doesn't prohibit teaching it in an academic context, as many people have falsely alleged. It says that's part B, I think, of section 10 of the order. It doesn't prevent you teaching it, doesn't prevent diversity training or sensitivity training or whatever you want to call the training. It says there are 11 things that you're not allowed to do. You can't racially discriminate, race or sex, actually. You can't racially or sexually scapegoat, blame an entire race or sex for problems. You can't racially or sex stereotype. You can't say that the country in this teaching is intrinsically a racist or evil or sexist place. And so it bans, technically, with the racial scapegoating and the racial stereotyping, it bans anti-Semitism also. It bans white supremacy. It bans patriarchy. It bans all the things that they would want to ban, in addition to also saying you can't do it in this neo-racist backwards way that critical race theory is cooked up by starting with the assumption that the country is intrinsically racist and everything that happens in it is intrinsically racist. And as Robin DiAngelo has phrased it about a dozen different times in a dozen different places, the question is no longer did racism take place, but rather how did racism manifest in that situation? That's where those trainings start, is that racism must be present in everything. And we're going to go find it. And the tool for finding it is called critical race theory. The order itself doesn't ban critical race theory. It bans 11 things that are racial scapegoating, discrimination, stereotyping, and blaming the country at an intrinsic level for being racist, sexist, white supremacist, whatever. I want to know why Joe Biden thinks that we should get rid of those things.
I was about to say, it makes you wonder, why is that such a bad thing?
Because they want to racially scapegoat, stereotype, discriminate, or blame the country. That's one of there's no other option.
Because they think the motivation for having done it is somehow itself an anti-black or anti-people of color motivation. Correct. And they want to be on the right side of history.
That's right.
Because the people who are actually going to be on the ground doing the work in the Biden administration are pretty much to a man and woman believers in this way of looking at the world.
Correct. And like I said, its first assumption is, and this is, again, pretty much a quote from Delgado and Stefanczyk, its first assumption is that racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society, not an aberration from them. That is, racism and white supremacy are, and this is their quote, the normal science of society.
So let's close out here. I mean, very good talking to you, James, and let's talk again sometime.
Yeah, we still got to figure out like if your mea culpa was incorrect, because I think you've got it backwards. I think you got it backwards, Glenn.
Okay, my mea culpa was I misjudged Trump's character defects, or at least the gravity and threat to the nation of his character defects, as manifest in his refusal to step aside after he had exhausted his remedies in the face of the election defeat. He put the country in jeopardy. I don't think he incited insurrection, quote unquote. That's me. I think that's an exaggeration. But I think he was playing with fire in this post-election environment. And it's dangerous for the republic. And I said I was wrong about minimizing the threat to the republic of Trump's narcissism and tendency to self-aggrandizement. So what's wrong with that?
So I don't have a problem with with saying that there's a risk in his narcissism, which I suspect is the case. And I also agree with you that he was playing with fire by continuing to push the issue of election fraud and misfeasance. That said, I think that the story goes the other way. I think that the reason that we perceive Trump as being maybe we could say Trump is a danger to democracy, is because he was off the script. There is a script that's been running, not in the conspiratorial sense, but that he came in, he was like, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the system. I'm going to drain the swamp, blah, blah, blah. And the swamp didn't want to get drained. The swamp did not want to be drained. And presenting that threat to their interests, holding China to account in a way that nobody else had, striking the counter narrative. Every time they went after him, rather than him bowing down and kowtowing, he stood back up and maybe he hit back harder. I think that what we see is a manufactured crisis around a guy where I take Trump's side on blaming the media for what we're looking at, not the media side blaming Trump for what we're looking at. And I think that that's where it goes backwards. I think that what happened was that somebody who wouldn't play their game got in power, and they, rather than ever trying, and this is the key point, rather than ever taking even a single step to tamp it down, they just ratcheted it up every single opportunity they got, often from very fine
one,
people.
not my president, from day one.
Not my president, yeah. And then just every story. Russian hoax, dictator. And I know you say that, after he exhausted his legal, he did actually step down. One of the things Twitter took down, videos that they removed, was Trump saying that my legal options have been used up. I will have an orderly, he didn't say peaceful, he said orderly transfer of power, blah, blah, blah. Another one of the videos they took down was him saying that you need to go home, you need to be peaceful, we need peace. Trump is a clumsy speaker. I think he's probably a sharper mind than people give him credit, but he's a peculiar speaker. And so I feel like that there is a deliberate ratcheting up around him. And my perspective on that is that he didn't go along with everything they wanted to have somebody go along with. And they ratcheted it up and ratcheted it up and ratcheted it up. So to blame Trump for not bowing to something that was trying to break him, I think is illegitimate. And so I do have and always have had concerns about his self-aggrandizement and his willingness to come out and say things about himself that were probably not true, and to push narratives past probably the point that they needed to be pushed. But at the same time, this is a much more complex and dynamic situation that has contributions and to what was going on that are far broader. And when you find yourself in a position like him, not to defend the fact that he goes too far and plays with fire, I find myself in this position a lot. There's no easy way to back down, because if you back down, you lose. So the scenario, a media storm creates a scenario where you have to be a bit of a jerk. And I live this, so I understand it. Because
something tells me that we are in the quiet of the storm, so to speak, that it's not over. It's not over by a long shot. And I just want, I don't know what's coming next, but I'm very worried about what might be coming next.
I vary between worried and despairing. But there are hopeful signs, so you never know. And I'm glad that there are people such as you and ourselves that are willing to have conversations and to tread the ground where you're not supposed to tread, and where tread where angels won't go.
Man, I'm going to get so much flack for talking to you, James Lindsay, but I'm glad I did, and I'm going to do it again if you give me the opportunity.
I would love to.
Thanks a lot.
If we can ever get over this stupid virus, we can get dinner or something sometime. That'd be great.
We didn't even talk about COVID. That's got to be a whole nother.
It's a whole thing
to do.
I'm probably not allowed to talk about that either. Don't worry.
Thanks, James Lindsay. And we'll talk again. Take care of yourself now.
Thanks, Glenn.